Broadcasting from New York City to the world, it's the G-Man Interviews.
Welcome. My special guest for this edition is Askold Krushelnycky, a British citizen and freelance journalist whose parents were refugees from Ukraine. Mr. Krushelnycky attended university in London, gaining BSc in industrial chemistry, and worked as a research scientist for a year. After realizing he didn't want to spend the rest of his life in a lab, he decided to pursue a career in journalism and went on to obtain a postgraduate diploma. His first stint as a journalist began in 1978, when he acquired a position at a local London newspaper. During the Soviet occupation of Afghanistan, he accompanied Mujahedin troops, then friendly to the West, fighting against Soviet forces. He also worked as a freelance reporter and staff journalist covering foreign affairs for national newspapers in the United Kingdom. He worked as a UK Sunday Times South Asia correspondent in New Delhi and covered India, Pakistan, Afghanistan, and Sri Lanka, and has frequently covered the Middle East. Since 1990, he spent the majority of his time in Central and Eastern Europe and the Balkans, reporting on the fall of communism, political transformations, and conflicts in the former USSR and former Yugoslavia. Between 1997 and 2011, he was based in Moscow, Kiev, and Prague. In 2011, he and his wife relocated to Washington, D.C. Mr. Krushelnycky is the author of An Orange Revolution, a personal journey through Ukrainian history, which was published in 2006 by Random House Harvel Secker. Currently, he's working on a second book that will focus on the turbulent events in Ukraine since the fall of 2013, when mass demonstrations turned into revolution and, ultimately, the present conflict between Russia and Ukraine. Recently, he was embedded in 3 military units, including the 37th Independent Mechanized Infantry Battalion, which is based near the Ukrainian port city of Mariupol, where fighting has continued since the ceasefire began on February 15. Mariupol is expected to face the brunt of the next major Russian assault, which he predicts will take place in June. It's a pleasure to welcome you to the show, sir.
It's very nice to be on your show. Thank you.
Given that you recently spent a great deal of time with the 37th Independent Mechanized Infantry Battalion, how would you describe the overall morale of the soldiers?
The morale overall is very high, in fact, surprisingly high, not just for the volunteers, but for the regular army as well, considering that they're heavily outnumbered, probably at least 10-1. And the Russia is openly now by Moscow, even though President Putin of Russia has consistently denied it. But U.S. intelligence, the U.S. government, NATO, Ukrainian army, West European sources, the Organization of Security and Cooperation in Europe, OSCE, they've all said that they've noted Russian weapons, tanks, APCs, that's armored personnel carriers, missile systems, heavy artillery, being transferred from Russia into the Ukraine. And everybody in Ukraine that I've spoken to believes that there will be a further escalation in fighting soon. But to get back to your original question, despite all of these things, the morale is high.
Reports have been published claiming members of the Swoboda Party, the ultra-right-wing group, and various neo-Nazi organizations have joined the Ukrainian army and boldly displayed Nazi symbols on their helmets and uniforms. Matthew Dubas, editor of the Ukrainian Weekly, appeared on this show and dismissed the claims as propaganda by the Russian government. While embedded with the battalion, did you hear or see anything that would confirm these reports?
With the 37th Battalion, which is also a volunteer battalion, I can honestly say that I didn't see anything like that, and that kind of talk or attitude that might be labeled as neo-Nazi or racist, and they eschewed it and they looked down on it. Having said that, I've also been embedded with 2 other units, and one of them is routinely described by the Russian press, which is part of Moscow's propaganda machine, as neo-Nazis. Now, some of these people do have what here would be described as right-wing attitude towards maybe race is something that we'd find distasteful. But they're not Nazis, they're not neo-Nazis. They are very much a minority of people who have right-wing ideas, right-wing sentiments. As you can tell from the accent, I'm from Britain, so we've got English nationalist parties which espouse racist views and very right-wing views which are rooted in prejudice and ignorance, I'd say, rather than some sort of conscious following or support for Nazis. And those people, they do exist, but they're a very small number or proportion of the armed forces that are fighting this Russian aggression. And to gauge how small they are, all of Ukraine's right-wing parties were barely able to muster, I think it was less than 5% of the vote, including the Svoboda party that you mentioned, in both general elections to the parliament and in elections for the presidency. Under 5%, well under 5%. And that may also be, probably, I'd guess, is their size reflected in the armed forces. But, I suppose, visible because the press come searching for evidence that Putin's propaganda machine, that Kyiv, the capital of Ukraine, and the government of Ukraine are neo-Nazis.
Who was primarily responsible for violating the February 15th ceasefire agreement?
I'd unhesitatingly say that it was the Russians, and I use the term Russians advisedly because I don't distinguish anymore between pro-Russian separatists backed by Moscow and Russia's President Putin and regular Russian military. So I blame Russia. Their proxy troops are called separatists and the Ukrainian government calls terrorists, directly under command of Moscow and President Putin. One of them, actually, this weekend, a famous, notorious leader of pro-Russian separatists in a place called Luhansk, was blown up along with about 7 of his men, all traveling in a vehicle. And even his men from his battalion accuse Moscow of being behind that. So I blame Russia and Moscow. I was there when a ceasefire broke out. I was at a place called Mariupol, which is a port city in the south of Ukraine, where there'd been very vigorous fighting in the weeks preceding the ceasefire, on a line about 5 or 6 miles east of the actual city. And I was there for almost 3 weeks after the ceasefire, and there wasn't a day or a night when there wasn't at least small arms fire. And for all but one day, there was some shelling. Most of it was coming in from the Russian side. And I have contacts of my own, people that I know and Ukrainian units that I've spent time with in other places in Ukraine. And so I know from my own personal contacts, not just daily reports by the OSCE, the Ukrainian government, NATO, that the ceasefire hasn't even been illusory because people have been dying every day. About 100 Ukrainian soldiers have died during this ceasefire. And for 2 weeks after the ceasefire erupted, the Russians didn't even break step in their march on a place called Debaltsevo, where fighting raged around 2 more weeks. And hundreds of Ukrainian soldiers, as well as Russians, were killed. So there never has been a ceasefire.
Ukrainian and Russian soldiers have been killed in the conflict, and I suspect there have been civilian casualties as well. What information do you have on that situation?
There are always civilian casualties, and I think in every conflict since the First World War, that was the last one. My history is correct, where people in uniform outnumbered the civilians in terms of deaths and other casualties. Since then, civilians have definitely taken the brunt of fighting, and this conflict is no different. I think that the latest UN figures are over 6,000, maybe coming up 7,000 deaths, and most of those would be civilian. I think about 1,100 Ukrainian soldiers have died, and in the same time, 4 or 5 times the number of civilians have died on both sides of the conflict line. And I'm skeptical about the 6,000 to 7,000 numbers in terms of casualties. I've got a feeling that it's far higher than that. And in the areas held by the Russian forces, there have been reports of people disappearing, and there are hundreds, thousands of people who have probably been murdered in the territory that's held by the pro-Russians and their Russian backers.
You recently stated that the Kremlin wanted to present Russian-speaking Ukrainians, as most of them are in the east of the country, as the same as pro-Russian Ukrainians and most ethnic Russians eager to join the Ruski Mir, or Russian world, that Putin is touting. But events have shown that most Ukrainians have no wish to be part of Putin's vision or to become incorporated, like Crimea, into the Russian Federation. Can you elaborate?
Yes, it's been from the beginning of Ukrainian independence after the disintegration of the Soviet Union in 1991. There's been this constant output of information or propaganda from Moscow that all these people, Ukrainians and Russians, are very similar. It's one people, but with Russia, the senior big brother, taking the leading role in that part of the world. And since Putin has been in power, and it's his 16th year now, he's killed off, not just figuratively, but literally in many cases, any kind of independent media. And for years and years, all the Russian people have heard is a pro-Putin, pro-Kremlin line. And they've emphasized this idea that Russian-speaking people anywhere in the former Soviet Empire are really kind of almost the same as Russians. And in 2008, Putin gave himself the power. It was rubber-stamped by the Russian parliament, which is almost entirely in his hands, that the Russian government and the Russian military have the right to intervene anywhere that Russian speakers are thought to be at some kind of risk. And this was the method used to justify the invasion of Georgia. Years before there was such a law even, Russia applied that kind of thinking to a country called Moldova, which it split in two on the pretext of protecting Russian speakers. And they've tried to apply that in Ukraine. And I think that they've been, some of the Kremlin propagandists, maybe Putin himself, have been startled that their overtures to make parts of Ukraine incorporated into Russia have been rebuffed, and the polls that could be carried out even at the beginning of the Russian occupation of part of eastern Ukraine, an area called Donbass, showed that the majority of people, even there, wanted to be part of Ukraine. They didn't want to be annexed by Russia. And in other parts that weren't occupied by Russia, there were just huge numbers. Overwhelmingly, people said that they did not want to be part of this Putin vision of rebuilding some sort of hodgepodge of Soviet Union, Russian Empire. And the three units that I've been embedded with, one unit twice, the other two one time each, they're overwhelmingly, and I'd say like 99% Russian speakers, but they are Ukrainian patriots. They don't want to be part of Russia, and they're amongst the fiercest fighters against Russian attempts to occupy eastern Ukraine or any part of Ukraine. And again, as a Brit, you've got the English, but you've got the Scottish, the Welsh, the Irish in Northern Ireland. Everybody speaks English, but if you call a Scotsman or a Welshman or an Irishman an Englishman, you're likely to get a very vigorous response.
NATO, the US, Europe, and many Ukrainians predict the fighting will resume this summer. If it does, what specific areas will Russia focus on and why?
Yes, I think that there is a lot of evidence that they will resume the fighting, and I concur with that. I expect June sometime. And Putin's troops took, without a shot being fired, Crimea last year. And
you were there, right?
I was there, and I saw this unfold, and I saw how intimidation. The local thugs worked hand in hand with the Russian forces, although Putin, for I don't know how many weeks, lied to the whole world and said they're not Russian forces. They didn't have the insignia on their uniforms. And the local people called them little green men because they said, well, if you haven't come from Russia, where have you come from? Mars. And these people worked hand in hand with the local sort of organized crime gangs, which were led by a guy whose nickname was Goblin. And he's well known as a criminal, and now he's president of the Autonomous Republic, or whatever it's called now, of Crimea. These people are using intimidation, walking around with their guns, organized a referendum which resulted in kind of North Korean numbers of support for annexation by Russia. It was something like 97%, which is impossible because even though the majority of that peninsula's inhabitants are Russian ethnics, about a third of them are Ukrainians and a people called the Tatar people, who are Muslim people, and it's their homeland. And they definitely did not vote for annexation by Russia. But also, I was surprised to find how many Russian ethnics there were at demonstrations that were against annexation by Moscow and which supported a unified Ukraine. So this number was impossibly high, and I'm not certain if there was a real referendum held there that there would be a majority for annexation by Russia. But everything that comes to Crimea, including water, Crimea is a barren peninsula, and water is piped in from Ukraine by a huge pipeline, but also gas, electricity, food, clothing, daily essentials, let alone luxuries, all come in from the Ukrainian mainland. Only a tiny proportion of this can be supplied by Russia by ship. And so the main aim of the next phase of Russian aggression, most people predict, will be to try to smash the way through from Russian-occupied eastern Ukraine to Crimea in order to provide a supply route and consolidate the Russian hold over Crimea.
The people of Ukraine have made it abundantly clear that they don't want U.S. forces to occupy their country and that U.S. weapons are all they need. If the U.S. stands down and Russia manages to seize control of the major sections of Ukraine, what do you suspect would happen shortly after the takeover?
I think that before the Russians manage to eliminate or destroy all of Ukraine's conventional forces, and the numbers at the moment show that if there was an all-out Russian assault, I've said previously, they outnumber the Ukrainian forces by at least 10 to 1. They outnumber them in terms of superior weaponry and the quantity of that superior weaponry. So Ukrainian forces, I think, would disband before being completely smashed. I know plans have been prepared for guerrilla war. Conventional forces would form the backbone of guerrilla forces, but many people have said that they're ready to fight in a guerrilla war to make it impossible for Russia to hold Ukraine. Yes, Russia can probably take Ukraine or vast swaths of it, but it won't be able to hold it. And the reason why there will be determined guerrilla warfare is that people know that a Russian takeover won't just entail the elimination of the Ukrainian government, but everyone who's been sympathetic to it will be punished in some ways. Lots of people would probably be executed, lots of people would probably be imprisoned, and the old Soviet gulags in Russia, in Siberia, would be back in business again. And others who worked or were pro-Ukrainian patriots, even if they weren't imprisoned, they would be then second-class citizens in their own land. Putin has openly declared his admiration for Stalin, and he's tried to justify or to gloss over the atrocious and obscene things that Stalin did. He's overseen the erection of new statues to Stalin, and people in Ukraine fear that, along with his admiration for Stalinist methods, which the last time they were applied to Ukraine cost millions and millions of lives. And that's why people see no choice but to fight on in guerrilla fashion if the conventional war doesn't become realistic anymore.
If Russia invades Ukraine, how concerned should former Soviet-occupied countries like Poland and the Baltic states be about being targeted next?
I don't think it's any more a question of how concerned they should be. They are very concerned, and everything that Putin has shown publicly points to a rebuilding in the areas formerly controlled by Moscow of a new empire of some sort. Anybody who's ever been in a Russian empire, whether it was the Russian Tsarist Empire or the Soviet Union, which was led by Russia effectively, nobody wants a repeat of that experience. The Russian presence in foreign countries has been always accompanied by mass executions, imprisonment, misery. So nobody wants to repeat that experience. And the Baltic countries, as you rightly say, are very concerned, especially the smaller ones, Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, feel that they would be next on the target list. And they're a bit worried that even though they're part of NATO, the NATO Charter says that an attack on one NATO member is to be regarded as an attack on all. But they fear that that kind of vigor for enforcing the NATO Charter might not fire up all the NATO members. They fear that they might be sacrificial lambs to Putin's continued aggression.
Some question whether the sanctions are working or not. And Matthew Dubas, again, the editor of the Ukrainian Weekly, indicated that Putin doesn't care about the sanctions. He does what he wants when he wants. Do you agree with that assessment?
I do agree with it, but I'd give a more nuanced answer. I think that there's no question that sanctions have had an economic effect in Russia. The Russian currency, the ruble, has lost much of its value. Business expansion has slowed down because they can't get credits in hard currency, dollars or euros, at the cheap rates that they could previously. So there's already been an economic effect, and it'll increase this year. And so far, he's been able to perhaps insulate ordinary Russians from the economic effect. But he won't be able to do that indefinitely. And then that will result in questions being asked, presumably, amongst some of Putin's supporters. Well, what are we getting for this aggression? Also, lots of people close to Putin or associated with his regime have been prevented from getting visas to travel to the West. Even though it may seem not very significant to us, it is for those people. It's an attack on their feeling of invincibility. Also, even though they portray themselves as great Russian patriots, they all have luxury homes, not in Russia, but in Britain, in London, in France, in Paris, in Cannes, other European countries, some here in the US. Their children go to school not in Moscow, but in England or in the US. They study at universities in Oxford, Yale, and Harvard, not at Moscow or St. Petersburg. Their wives and mistresses go for shopping expeditions, not to Moscow or Minsk. They go to New York, London, Paris, Rome. And I know that this has had a pretty deep effect on morale. So these sanctions have had their effect, but he's painted himself into a corner where his support now rests on his supposed military prowess in conquering Crimea and taking parts of eastern Ukraine. And we've seen in the past with people like that, including Hitler, whose actions Putin has very much paralleled. In fact, in an extraordinary way, he's acted the same as Hitler. But these people, once they set a course of aggression, the only way that they seem to be able to maintain support is by whipping up a jingoistic, chauvinistic, fascistic type of enthusiasm amongst their people. And unless they feed it with more victories, things take a bad turn. Putin isn't somebody who's demonstrated a capacity for compromise. He's broken all the rules of civilized behavior. He's turned the clock back in Europe. since the Second World War, nobody's attempted to take territory by military means. He's rolled that back. He's never going to be invited to polite diplomatic society by Western leaders. So, in a way, he's painted himself into a corner, and I fear that the only way he knows of going forward is to go forward by tanks and further brutality and aggression.
How would you rate the coverage of the crisis by the American media?
I think that by and large, it has been very good. And I've worked alongside the American media through much of my professional life, and I think that they try to do it properly, and they have tried to do it properly here. I also know from working as a British newspaper man, after you've done it for a long time, and I have, I'm older than you, a lot older than you, and I've been a journalist for 3 decades. And big events like this follow almost a cyclical procession where people are divided into, or the sides are divided into mainly good, mainly bad, and that's been a no-brainer here. And Ukraine is the country that was invaded and is defending itself. And I think that's the prevalent view that's been portrayed. But after a while, people are looking around for a different way of getting into the story, and so the good guys are portrayed as not completely angelic, and both sides have got bad guys working within their ranks. And I think that we've seen that in the American media's portrayal of events. But by and large, I think the facts are so clear on the ground in terms of who the aggressor is. And also, the Ukrainian people and the Ukrainian government has stated that they not only admire Western values, but that they understand them and that they want to have those Western values as their guiding principles in the way Ukraine develops. And I think that any Western journalist, not just American, quickly realizes that when they come to Ukraine, Ukrainians, during the big demonstrations which preceded this conflict, risked their lives, gave their lives. They were shot down by the pro-Russian former president's security people. 100 unarmed protesters were killed. And since then, they've sought to defend those values, those Western values, again, laying down their lives. So I think that the American media has reflected that. I think it's an accurate picture, and I think that Ukraine, and I'm not just saying that because I am of Ukrainian origin, I'm saying that as a Brit, somebody born in Britain and who has been brought up on Western values, somebody who's lived for years in the US and is about to become a US citizen on June the 9th. I say these are our values, they're Western values, and if the US and Western Europe and other pro-democratic countries don't step up and help, this won't be just a loss for Ukraine. It'll be a loss for the entire democratic world. And there aren't too many of us around these days, as events all over the world see. So Ukraine saved can shore up not only Ukraine's democracy, but can help to ensure and defend the rest of the democratic world's values and the things that we think make a society right and decent.
Thank you for being here, Mr. Krushelnycky. I know you'll be heading back to Ukraine soon, so please take care.
Thank you. Thank you very much indeed for having me on your program. Thank you.
A link to Mr. Krushelnycky's book, An Orange Revolution, A Personal Journey Through Ukrainian History, has been posted in the description area, as well as links to some of his articles. I'm the G-Man, and until next time, stay cool, stay safe, and stay informed.